I wanted to put this up on the board because this is all based on what I believe in, which is mindfulness-based stress reduction, and which I'm going to be getting to. So these are taken from a book. Has anybody ever heard of Jon Kabat-Zinn? Oh, good, a few of you. Jon Kabat-Zinn has really been a pioneer in the field of stress reduction. He wrote this book, Full Catastrophe Living, which is based on, do you know that Zorba the Greek joke? That Zorba was asked by somebody, you know, Zorba, how do you do it? And Zorba says, oh, you know, I've got the wife and the kids and the grandkids and things falling apart and everything changing and, you know, the whole catastrophe. So that's how he described his life. And I think it's a pretty good description for the life of a caregiver and care recipient. A friend of mine sees the pair, caregiver, care recipient, as care partners. And I love that. I love that term because it is a partnership. So what do we see in this? Briefly, we see that from our earliest ancestors, we're programmed to deal with stress in certain ways. And that first thing, that top part, is the stressor, which could be anything. It could be seeing a snake, or it could be the stress of working with somebody whom you love who's becoming increasingly frail. And what that does is it sets in motion a whole cascade of events, including that your heartbeat changes, your blood pressure changes, your digestive system responds in certain ways. A lot of this is the result of different hormones being secreted into your bloodstream as a way of coping with what you perceive as stressful. And you know what some of those hormones are. Adrenaline is one. These are the things that give rise to what we call the fight or flight response. You've all, I would imagine, heard of that. That essentially in response to stress, we're sort of back in the dinosaur age. We're still responding the way we did back then. That as sophisticated as we've become in some ways, our physiology, our bodies still respond as they used to. So what happens is our adrenaline starts pumping through our system. Norepinephrine and epinephrine pump through our system. These are all the kinds of things that constrict the pupils, that expand, you know, send blood rushing to the large muscles so that you're prepared to run or to fight with somebody. These are natural reactions. But what happens if you have chronic stress is that your body goes into a state of what we call hyperarousal. And one of the things, I don't know if people here who are caregivers have heard about cortisol, which is a stress hormone which is also released into the body at the same time as adrenaline and epinephrine. Now, the thing about cortisol is that initially it helps us, gives us some energy and increases our memory. But too much cortisol over a period of time reaches a point where it starts flooding the memory center of the brain, and eventually your memory decreases. And this is what I see a lot of caregivers say to me. They are having so much trouble remembering stuff. They worry that they're losing their minds. Well, a lot of that is a result of chronic stress and cortisol. And cortisol is one of the things that's used to measure caregiver stress. And there are many studies, which I'm not going to go into at all here, but you can look into them. That's a lot of how we measure how do caregivers respond to caregiving. So a lot of that, if you have chronic stress and chronic cortisol, it goes into what we call toxic stress. And that's a lot of where you see this chronic hyperarousal, high blood pressure, people suffering from things like headaches, exhaustion, digestive problems, anxiety. What does that lead to often? Maladaptive coping. There we see often the kinds of behaviors that people get into when they're extremely stressed, such as drinking too much, eating too much, smoking. Remember that 208% more likely to smoke? Okay, so that's a lot of what I see. Now, where's the hope for us? The hope for us is that it isn't just the stress, it isn't just the circumstances of our lives that create stress in us, but rather it's our perception of those circumstances that create stress. Okay? That is the hope. And that's what we have to and can learn to do, believe me, because that's what I teach and that's what became true for me in working with our stress and our self-care. Now, Vivian had mentioned some really important ways of taking care of ourselves. The first thing I always ask people is, how do you know you're stressed? People say they're stressed. Well, they often stop to think, well, I don't know, I don't sleep at night, or I had a heart attack. One of the caregivers who was caring for his mom for a long time with dementia and who refused, nobody could take care of his mother the way he could. Well, he had a massive heart attack. He's 61 years old. And guess what? He couldn't take care of his mother. I can't tell you how many times it comes to that overworking, that breakdown, heart attack, cancer, physical, psychological breakdown. So what do we do to not get there? First of all, we have to recognize that we're stressed. And as I said, a lot of people don't recognize that they're stressed. How do you know you're stressed? Does anybody want to tell me? You get really tired. That's a big one. What else? Who said that? Yeah, thank you. Angry. That's you want to scream. Overeating. Absolutely. What else? Disappointments. Oh, missing appointments. Forgetfulness. Absolutely. Remember that cortisol thing? Memory? What else? Very negative. Yeah. Okay, and we could mention what else wasn't mentioned. Trouble sleeping. Thank you. What about social isolation? That's a big one. Don't have time. Remember that first one? Don't have time to take care of myself. Can't do it. And one of the things that I mentioned initially, one of the first things has to do with denial. How many people just immediately accepted that their parent or their loved one was starting to slip? Denial is a big one. Sometimes I had a woman who came to one of my support groups for 3 years before she could say that her husband was losing his mind. She sat there. She knew she needed to be there. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't admit it to herself.